Attention! Prepare for a deep journey into one of the most macabre and disturbing cases in Salem's history. Before starting, I ask that you write in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is right now. We also ask that you subscribe by clicking subscribe to help us produce more documented accounts like this every day. In the winter of 1951, Salem was not just a city known for its infamous witchcraft history. The cobblestone streets, Victorian mansions, and the sea breeze that cut through the misty mornings hid another kind of darkness, one that few dared to mention. It was that year that the first disappearances began. Young women, all sharing one common trait, an extraordinary beauty that, according to accounts from the time, seemed almost supernatural in its perfection. The first was Eleanor Blackwood, 23 years old, whose black hair and porcelain skin made men turn their heads in the streets to admire her. She disappeared after leaving the doctor's office downtown. Dr. Harvey Mitchell was the last person to see her alive. According to his testimony recorded in the municipal archives, Eleanor had attended a routine checkup and left around 5 o'clock. What happened after that remained a mystery for many decades. The local police, led by Sheriff Thomas Caldwell, a 48-year-old man with an impeccable record in the department, began a discreet investigation. At that time, the city was still struggling to recover from the post-war recession, and tourism based on the infamous history of witchcraft was beginning to flourish. A disappearance case was not something the authorities wished to make public. The Salem Police Department files, found decades later during the 1962 renovation, reveal that the investigation was conducted with the least possible fanfare. Sheriff Caldwell interviewed neighbors, family, and acquaintances. Everyone described Eleanor as a reserved young woman with simple habits who worked as an assistant at the municipal library and had no known enemies. One detail, however, appeared repeatedly in the testimonies. In the weeks before her disappearance, Eleanor had mentioned being invited to attend private meetings at Thornfield Manor on the north end of the city, a property that had belonged to the Hawthorne family since the 18th century. Thornfield Manor stood imposingly atop a small hill surrounded by a meticulously maintained garden, even during the harsh winter. The property belonged to Victoria Hawthorne, a 52-year-old woman whose physical appearance defied logic. A widow for over 2 decades, Victoria maintained an almost impossible youthfulness for her age. Her face was devoid of the marks of time that usually affect women in their 50s, and her posture was that of a 30-year-old woman. The Hawthorne family occupied a prominent position in Salem's social hierarchy. Victoria was known for her generous contributions to the restoration of historic buildings and for being the main sponsor of the new municipal museum. Her influence extended to every corner of the city administration. According to reports from the time, no important decision was made without her being consulted, even informally. In mid-February of that same year, a second young woman disappeared. Margaret Collins, 25 years old, a local primary school teacher, did not show up to teach on a Monday. When the police went to investigate her apartment on Essex Street, they found everything in perfect order, as if she had left for a quick appointment and intended to return soon. The local newspaper, the Salem Gazette, published a small note about the incident on February 17, 1951, framing the case as a temporary absence and suggesting the young woman had traveled to visit relatives without proper notification. What the newspaper did not mention, as later revealed by internal editorial documents, was that the editor had received a call from the mayor's office requesting discretion in handling the case. Mayor Richard Montgomery, a close ally of the Hawthorne family, was personally interested in keeping the situation out of the spotlight. What connected these two young women, besides their unusual beauty, was the fact that both had been seen at Thornfield Manor in the weeks prior to their disappearances. This information, however, was not included in any official report. A diary found decades later, belonging to Martha Jenkins, a close friend of Margaret's, revealed that the teacher had confided in being extremely excited about an invitation to participate in exclusive meetings organized by Victoria Hawthorne. Margaret said it was a select group of women who met to discuss topics of beauty and youth, Martha wrote. She mentioned a revolutionary treatment that Victoria had discovered during a trip to the Orient. Something about the secret of eternal youth. The winter gave way to spring, and with the thaw, 3 more young women disappeared under similar circumstances. All were known for their exceptional beauty, all had been seen entering Thornfield Manor, and none of them left any trace of where they might have gone. Sheriff Caldwell began to notice a pattern, but his attempts to investigate the Hawthorne property were systematically blocked by higher orders. In his personal notes, found after his death in 1958, he wrote, "There is something deeply wrong with that house. When I approach the gate, I feel a cold that does not come from the weather. I tried to get a warrant 3 times, but Judge Montgomery refuses to sign it. It is as if the entire city is under some kind of spell, unable to see the obvious." The situation changed drastically when Sarah Peterson, the mayor's own niece, disappeared in April 1951. Sarah, a 22-year-old young woman, had recently returned to Salem after completing her studies in Boston. With golden hair and deep blue eyes, she had immediately attracted the attention of Victoria Hawthorne during a charity event at the mayor's office. Witnesses reported seeing the two talking animatedly and Victoria inviting the young woman to visit her mansion. 3 days later, Sarah disappeared. This time, not even Victoria's influence was enough to prevent a more in-depth investigation. Mayor Montgomery, devastated by his niece's disappearance, authorized Sheriff Caldwell to conduct searches throughout the city, including the Hawthorne property. On the morning of April 27, 1951, Sheriff Caldwell and a team of 5 officers headed to Thornfield Manor. According to police reports preserved in the Essex County Archives, Victoria received them with disturbing calm, offering tea and showing herself to be completely cooperative. "The house is open to you, gentlemen. I have nothing to hide," she reportedly said, with a smile the sheriff later described as the most perfect mask I have ever seen on a human face. The initial search revealed nothing suspicious. The mansion, with its 32 rooms spread across 3 floors, was a labyrinth of hallways, stairs, and doors. Antique furniture, elaborate tapestries, and valuable artwork decorated the rooms. However, there was no sign of the missing young women or anything that could incriminate her. It was the youngest officer on the team, Michael Turner, newly arrived from Boston, who noticed something strange. In Victoria's main office, a bookshelf seemed slightly misaligned with the wall. After a more detailed inspection, they discovered that the bookshelf was actually a door leading to a descending staircase. Victoria, who had been closely accompanying them throughout the search, suddenly changed her demeanor. "That is merely access to the family wine cellar, a private area irrelevant to the investigation," she argued, trying to stop them from descending. Sheriff Caldwell, however, was determined. With the search warrant in hand, he insisted on checking the location. What they found in the depths of that mansion would be forever etched into Salem's dark history. A series of underground tunnels, lit by modern electric lamps, extended beneath the property. The first room they accessed looked like a sophisticated laboratory with advanced medical equipment for the time, vials containing unknown substances, and several anatomy and chemistry books. On a central table, they found a detailed diary, handwritten by Victoria, describing experiments with what she called the essence of youth. The most recent pages mentioned the 5 missing women and contained clinical observations about their reactions to the treatment. Continuing through the tunnels, the team reached a room that the official report describes only as the Preservation Hall. The exact contents of this location were kept secret for decades, with official documents undergoing heavy censorship. However, a personal letter written by Officer Turner to his brother, found in 1968 during the demolition of the house where he lived, offers a disturbing description. What we saw in that underground hall defies any sense of humanity. 5 women, the missing persons we were looking for, were arranged in a kind of circle, connected to machines by tubes extracting something from them. Blood, fluids, I cannot say for sure. They were conscious, but in a state of deep stupor, unable to speak or move. The most disturbing thing, however, was Victoria. When we entered the hall, she was lying in the center of the circle in a sort of tub, with the liquid extracted from the women being pumped directly onto her skin. That is when we understood how she maintained that impossible youth. Victoria Hawthorne was immediately detained, but the legal consequences of her actions never reached the public. Records from the time show she was taken not to the local jail, but to an unspecified federal facility. The 5 women were rescued, but their condition was critical. Subjected to intensive medical treatment at Salem Memorial Hospital, none of them fully regained consciousness. Eleanor Blackwood, the first to disappear, died 3 days after the rescue. The other 4 remained in a state described by doctors of the time as permanent catatonia, eventually being transferred to specialized institutions in different parts of the country. Sarah Peterson, the mayor's niece, was the only one who showed signs of recovery, but she never spoke of the incident again. She left Salem permanently in 1952, moving to California, where she lived reclusively until her death in 1965. The case was quickly covered up by local and federal authorities. The Department of Health sent a team that confiscated all equipment found in the underground laboratory, and access to the mansion was strictly prohibited. Mayor Montgomery resigned 2 weeks after the incident, citing health problems as the official reason. Sheriff Caldwell was promoted and transferred to Washington, where he worked in a special division of the federal government, whose records remain classified to this day. Thornfield Manor was sealed by court order and remained abandoned for more than a decade, until it was completely destroyed by a mysterious fire in 1962. Curiously, the fire did not spread to any neighboring property, consuming exclusively the mansion's structure and presumably the underground tunnels that held its secrets. What truly happened in those underground chambers remained a mystery until 1958, when a series of documents was discovered during the renovation of an old property that had belonged to one of the founding members of what would become known as the Order of Eternal Beauty. These documents, dating back to 1827, revealed the existence of a secret society led by women of Salem's high society, dedicated to the pursuit of perpetual youth and beauty. Victoria Hawthorne was only the most recent in a lineage of guardians stretching back almost 2 centuries. The manuscripts described rituals mixing ancient medical knowledge, alchemy, and esoteric practices brought from the Orient. Central to these rituals was the belief that youth could be literally extracted from young bodies and transferred to others through a process they called vital transfusion. The first experiments, conducted in the mid-19th century, used animals as the source of this vital essence. With the advancement of medicine and technology, however, the process was refined and eventually came to use human beings. A diary belonging to Eliza Hawthorne, Victoria's great-great-grandmother, dated 1842, contains the first mention of a successful transfer using a volunteer donor, a young woman identified only as MS. The text suggests the young woman did not survive the procedure, but that the effects on the recipient, Eliza, were miraculous and immediate. She wrote, "The wrinkles disappear like snow in the sun. The skin regains its firmness and luminosity, the hair shines again. It is like being born anew, but with all the wisdom of the years lived." Over the following decades, the order operated clandestinely, recruiting new members from Salem's most influential families and perfecting their techniques. Initially, they used destitute women without family or connections, those whose disappearance would hardly be investigated seriously. Over time, they became bolder, developing methods to keep their donors alive for longer periods, gradually extracting their vitality instead of consuming it all at once. Victoria Hawthorne represented the peak of this evolution. With access to modern medical knowledge and sophisticated equipment, she managed to create a system that kept her victims in a state of controlled hibernation, continuously extracting what the documents called vital plasma, a combination of blood and other bodily fluids processed through procedures described in disturbing detail in the confiscated diaries. The crucial difference in Victoria's case was the scale of her operation. While her predecessors worked with one donor at a time, she developed a system that allowed the vital essence to be extracted from multiple women simultaneously, amplifying the effects and dramatically prolonging her own youth. The discovered documents also revealed the existence of a protection network that extended far beyond Salem. Members of the order held positions of power in Boston, New York, and even Washington, ensuring that any investigation that got too close to their secrets was quickly redirected or shut down. This network explains why Victoria was never publicly tried and why the official case records were so heavily censored. It also explains the fate of the other women rescued from that chamber of horrors, transferred to institutions controlled by members or allies of the order, where they could be silenced permanently. One of the most disturbing aspects revealed by the documentation is how the order selected its victims. It was not just about randomly chosen young and beautiful women. There was a meticulous evaluation process, which included medical examinations disguised as routine checkups conducted by Dr. Harvey Mitchell, the same Dr. Eleanor Blackwood visited before disappearing. These exams sought to identify specific biological markers that, according to the order's belief, indicated a particularly potent vital essence. The selected young women were then approached socially, lured with promises of inclusion in exclusive circles, job offers, or other personalized incentives. Victoria proved exceptionally skilled at this process of psychological seduction, managing to gain the trust of her victims without raising any suspicion. In the summer of 1959, Sarah Peterson, the ex-mayor's niece and the only survivor who maintained some cognitive ability, broke her silence. In an interview given to an investigative journalist at the Boston Globe, she offered a fragmented but disturbing account of her experience. The interview was never published. The journalist was found dead in his apartment days later, victim of what was officially classified as cardiac arrest, despite being only 32 years old and having no history of heart problems. The original manuscript of the interview, however, survived, hidden among the personal effects of the journalist that his family preserved. In this document, Sarah describes how she was seduced by the idea of participating in an exclusive circle of women who, according to Victoria, had discovered the secret to transcending the limitations imposed on femininity by society and nature itself. The initial meetings were sophisticated and intellectually stimulating, with discussions about art, philosophy, and advanced science. Gradually, Victoria introduced the order's central concept, the idea that youth and beauty could not only be preserved, but perpetuated indefinitely through practices combining modern science and ancient wisdom. She showed us photographs of herself over 30 years, and there was no sign of aging, Sarah reported. That seemed impossible, but the evidence was before our eyes. Sarah's account becomes more fragmented when describing what happened after she agreed to undergo the first stage of treatment. She mentions a sweet-tasting drink, a deep sleep, and then waking up partially conscious but unable to move in an underground environment. I could feel something being extracted from me, as if my very essence was being sucked out of my body. Victoria was there, always, watching with those eyes that seemed to absorb not just my image, but my very soul. And there were other women, connected like me, all in different stages of what she called the transcendence process. The most disturbing part of Sarah's account describes what she called the ceremony. Apparently, when a donor reached a certain point of exhaustion, a ritual was performed where the senior members of the order gathered to witness and participate in the final transfer. Sarah claims to have witnessed one of these ceremonies shortly before her rescue. The victim was Margaret Collins, the teacher who had been the second to disappear. They placed her on a kind of central altar. Victoria was dressed in a white ceremonial gown. The other members formed a circle around. There were chants in a language I did not recognize. And then they began to extract everything from her, not just fluids or essence, but something deeper. When it was over, Margaret looked like an empty shell, and Victoria seemed to radiate youth and vitality like never before. In 1961, a decade after the events at Thornfield Manor, a researcher from the Harvard University Anthropology Department, Dr. Jonathan Richards, began investigating the order's history as part of a broader study on secret cults in New England. His research led him to discover connections that the authorities had ignored or deliberately concealed. In particular, he established a direct link between the Order of Eternal Beauty and an older cult that had existed in Salem during the colonial period, long before the famous witch trials. This earlier cult, according to documents preserved in the university library, was known as the Keepers of the Vital Blood and had its origins among colonists who had been exposed to esoteric practices in Europe before emigrating to the New World. Curiously, several of the women accused during the witchcraft trials of 1692 had connections to this group, suggesting that the accusations may have been motivated not by mass hysteria, as is commonly believed, but by a deliberate effort to eliminate a sect whose practices were considered heretical, even by the extreme standards of the Puritans. Dr. Richards never published his findings. In January 1962, he disappeared during a visit to Salem, where he intended to examine the charred remains of Thornfield Manor after the fire that destroyed it. His body was found 3 weeks later in the woods north of the city. The official report attributed his death to hypothermia, resulting from disorientation in the woods during adverse weather conditions. Curiously, the body showed no signs of prolonged exposure to the elements, and witnesses reported seeing the professor in the company of an exceptionally beautiful and young woman shortly before his disappearance. The destruction of Thornfield Manor by fire in 1962 should have marked the definitive end of the Order of Eternal Beauty. However, circumstantial evidence suggests that at least some of its members survived and possibly continued their practices elsewhere. Real estate records show that in the months following the original incident at the manor, several properties in neighboring towns were acquired by foundations and shell companies that, when investigated, revealed indirect connections to known associates of Victoria Hawthorne. More significant was the emergence in the following years of a network of exclusive spas and rejuvenation clinics in various East Coast cities. These facilities, operating under the corporate name Eternal Rebirth, offered revolutionary cosmetic treatments promising to reverse the biological clock through proprietary techniques that were never disclosed in detail. The price of these treatments was exorbitant, and the clientele was strictly selected through an admission process that included extensive medical examinations. Curiously, several of these clinics were abruptly shut down following federal inspections in 1968, and all documentation related to the investigations was classified under claims of national security. The final fate of Victoria Hawthorne remains one of the most mysterious aspects of this story. Officially, she died in government custody in 1953, a victim of cardiac complications. However, there are no records of her burial, and no death certificate was publicly issued. In 1957, a nurse working at the facility where Victoria was allegedly being held reported seeing an elderly woman whose appearance matched the description of Victoria being transferred overnight to an unmarked vehicle. The nurse was dismissed shortly after, and her accounts were discredited by the authorities. In 1964, a freelance photographer accidentally captured the image of a woman during a social event in New York that bore a striking resemblance to Victoria Hawthorne in her prime. The woman in the photograph appeared to be no more than 30 years old, although Victoria would have been 65 at that time, if she was still alive. The photograph was briefly published in a local society magazine before being withdrawn from circulation. The photographer later reported that all copies and negatives mysteriously vanished from his studio during a burglary in which no valuable equipment was taken. The last documented mention of the Order of Eternal Beauty appears in a confidential report from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, dated April 1969. The document, partially declassified decades later through the Freedom of Information Act, mentions the disruption of a clandestine operation involving unauthorized medical practices for cosmetic purposes at an isolated property in the Adirondack Mountains, New York State. The report refers to methodologies similar to those observed in the Salem H case of '51. A code corresponding to the Thornfield Manor incident. 5 women were rescued from the facility, all in critical health, showing signs of systematic drainage of vital fluids. None of the suspects were captured on site, but evidence suggested the operation had been hastily evacuated just before the authorities arrived. Among the items recovered from the property was a leather-bound book containing what appeared to be the Order's complete doctrine, handwritten in a combination of archaic English and esoteric symbols. A page from this document, reproduced in the FBI report, contains what seems to be the Order's central oath. By the blood offered and received, by the essence yielded and absorbed, we transcend the chains of time. The youth of others becomes our eternity. The beauty we reap fuels our immortality. We are the keepers of the eternal secret, and our pact is sealed not with ink, but with the vital essence of those we sacrifice on the altar of perpetual beauty. In the following decades, the history of the Order of Eternal Beauty gradually transformed into an urban legend, often distorted and romanticized. Salem's tourist tours occasionally mention Thornfield Manor as one of the city's haunted sites, although the version told to visitors rarely approaches the macabre truth. The land where the mansion stood remained empty for years, with several development attempts mysteriously abandoned after inexplicable accidents or sudden financial problems. Finally, in 1982, the land was converted into a small public park, with a plaque commemorating the victims of the tragic Fire of '62, with no mention of the previous events or the true nature of the property. In 2009, during infrastructure work in the park, workers accidentally discovered the entrance to the underground tunnels that had survived the fire. Authorities quickly isolated the area and, according to unofficial reports, a specialized federal government team took control of the operation. The site was completely concreted over, and the workers involved in the initial discovery signed confidentiality agreements. An official statement merely stated that unstable structural remains of an ancient construction had been found and duly treated to ensure public safety. However, before the complete sealing, one of the workers managed to take photographs of the interior of the tunnels with his cell phone. These images, which circulated briefly online before being removed under claims of copyright infringement, showed surprisingly well-preserved stone corridors, and more disturbingly, what appeared to be a circular room with a central altar and old medical equipment, partially melted by the heat but still recognizable. On the walls, symbols carved into the stone combined alchemical motifs with what experts identified as an obscure variation of Norse runes associated with life extension rituals. Among the few objects recovered from the site before sealing was a silver locket, oxidized by time, but with its design still visible. a stylized drop of blood surrounded by 5 stars, the Order's known symbol. This artifact was allegedly sent for analysis to a federal laboratory and was never seen publicly again. Persistent rumors among Salem municipal employees suggest the locket disappeared in transit, along with the federal agent in charge of its transportation. In 2017, an elderly woman hospitalized in a Rhode Island asylum, identified only as Jane Doe No. 64 due to the lack of documentation or known relatives, began making disturbing statements during therapy sessions. According to the psychiatric report, partially leaked online, the woman claimed to be over 100 years old, although her physical appearance suggested someone in their 80s. Her revelations included detailed descriptions of vital essence, extraction rituals from young women, conducted by a group she called Victoria's Chosen. More significantly, the woman described a passing of the mantle ceremony that took place in the mid-60s, in which Victoria Hawthorne, supposedly dead for years, transferred the Order's leadership to a chosen successor. According to her account, this ceremony included the transfer not only of knowledge and authority, but also of a part of Victoria's own vital essence, allowing her successor to carry not only the legacy, but the very life force of the lineage. The patient passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks after beginning these revelations, and her body was quickly cremated by order of an anonymous prosecutor who presented impeccable legal documentation authorizing the procedure. The possibility that the Order of Eternal Beauty still exists today, operating in the shadows with more sophisticated and discreet methods, cannot be completely ruled out. Over the last few decades, occasional reports have surfaced of extremely exclusive rejuvenation clinics operating in remote locations around the world, offering results that seem to defy the limitations of modern medical science. These facilities invariably serve only extremely wealthy and influential clients and are protected by layers of physical and legal security that make them virtually impenetrable to investigators or authorities. Simultaneously, occasional cases of exceptionally beautiful young women who disappear under mysterious circumstances persist, frequently after being approached with offers of modeling contracts or opportunities in the beauty world. Most of these cases are investigated individually without broader connections being established, and many are eventually filed as voluntary runaways or unsolved abductions. The scattered and seemingly unrelated nature of these disappearances makes it virtually impossible to establish a pattern that could point to the Order's continued activity. One final and disturbing detail. In 2018, an independent researcher investigating the Order's history for a possible book reported being approached by an extremely elegant and young-looking woman after a public lecture on the subject at a Massachusetts university. The woman, who did not identify herself, allegedly offered access to original documents related to the Order in exchange for a private meeting to discuss the matter. The researcher accepted the invitation and was last seen leaving the campus with the mysterious woman. Her disappearance was investigated by local authorities, but no conclusive leads were found. Her computer and research notes also vanished from her apartment, which showed no signs of forced entry or struggle, while the tunnels beneath the former Thornfield Manor grounds remain sealed in concrete and official records continue to be partially classified. The true history of the Order of Eternal Beauty and the final fate of Victoria Hawthorne remain one of Salem's darkest secrets. Visitors walking through the tranquil park built over the mansion's remains today rarely imagine the horrors that occurred feet beneath their feet, or suspect that the roots of that macabre organization may have survived fire, time, and investigation, continuing to flourish in the shadows of the contemporary world. For those with truly observant eyes, however, the signs remain visible. In certain exclusive high society circles, elderly women occasionally appear whose physical appearance inexplicably defies the passage of years, and on their discreet jewellery a sharp observer might notice the almost imperceptible symbol of a drop of blood surrounded by 5 stars, the emblem of those who discovered the secret of eternal beauty and paid for it with the lives of others. The Order's true legacy lies not only in the crimes documented at Thornfield Manor in 1951, but in the haunting question that persists: how far would someone go to preserve youth and beauty eternally? And more disturbingly, if the opportunity presented itself with all guarantees of impunity, how many people today would resist the temptation that consumed Victoria Hawthorne and her followers? Beauty, after all, has always had its price. For the members of the Order, the price was the lives of other people, a cost they were more than willing to pay on the altar of their own immortal vanity.